I had learned to live with silence. Not the kind that fills an empty room, but the kind that builds walls between people who once shared laughter. For 7 years, my son and I had spoken only through clipped messages, bank transfers, holiday reminders, and those emotionless got it replies. But tonight, the phone rang at 2:17 a.m. And when I answered, a trembling voice whispered a single word I had forgotten the sound of. Mom. I had just finished turning off the porch light when the rain began. It wasn't a storm, just a quiet drizzle that made the street lamps blur into halos. Nights like these always made me restless. They reminded me of the night he left. The kettle clicked off. I poured hot water over chamomile and stared at the steam curling upward like a ghost with something to say. My phone lay on the counter, screen dark. For a moment, I thought of calling him. Then, like every night, I told myself, he doesn't want to hear from you. When the phone rang, it startled me so much I spilt tea over my sleeve. Unknown number. My first thought was scam call. My second, an absurd flicker of hope. Hello? I said, pressing the phone to my ear. There was breathing on the other end. A shaky inhale, then a soft exhale. My stomach twisted. Who's there? Silence stretched so long I thought the line had died. Then, quietly, almost broken, Mom. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the floor. For a heartbeat, I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. It had been 7 years since that word had left his lips, 7 birthdays missed, 7 Christmases of sending gifts returned unopened. Eli? My voice trembled. Eli, is that you? He didn't answer immediately. I could hear movement. Footsteps, maybe traffic, a faint hum of machines. Then he spoke again. Slower this time, as if tasting the word after years of forgetting its shape. I didn't know who else to call. What happened? I asked. My mind raced through every possibility. Accident, heartbreak, debt. Are you hurt? Where are you? A pause. St. Mary's, room 204. My knees gave out. I sat on the kitchen floor among shards of porcelain. St. Mary's was the hospital on the other side of town, the one his father had been taken to the night he died. Eli had refused to set foot there ever since. I'll be right there, I said. Mom? The word stopped me mid-movement. Please, just come. The line went dead. I sat for a second, letting the sound of rain fill the kitchen. Then I grabbed my keys, my coat, and the small cross that had hung above the sink since before Eli was born. The roads glistened like wet glass. Every traffic light seemed to hold its red longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. Images flickered in my mind. The day he left for university, our last argument in the driveway, the slam of the car door that sounded too final. At the entry building, a nurse recognized panic before I spoke. Room 204? I gasped. She pointed down the hall. When I pushed open the door, the smell of antiseptic hit first. Then I saw him, my son, sitting on the edge of a bed, arm bandaged, ivy trailing, face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. He looked older, thinner, but still the same child whose first tooth I'd kept in a velvet box. He looked up. Hey. That single word nearly undid me. I wanted to rush to him, to hold him, but the distance between us wasn't measured in steps. It was in years. What happened? I asked. Car accident, he murmured. Nothing serious. I just didn't want to be alone. I swallowed hard. You could have called anyone. He met my eyes then, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy who used to build pillow forts and fall asleep on my lap. No, he said softly. I couldn't. The rain tapped against the window. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped steadily, reminding me that hearts, no matter how broken, can still keep time. I pulled the chair close to his bed and sat. We didn't speak for a long time, but the silence was different now. Not cold, not sharp. It was waiting. He turned his head toward me, voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. Tears came before I could stop them. So am I said. For the first time in 7 years, the distance between us began to dissolve, not with grand apologies, but with quiet breathing, shared space, and the fragile magic of a single word. Mom. They say time heals all wounds, but no one ever tells you that time also teaches you how to live with the pain. How to water your plants, pay your bills, and smile at neighbors while carrying a silence that could drown you. After that night in the hospital, as I sat by Eli's bed watching the soft glow of the monitors, memories began to creep back. 7 years worth of words we never said. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling slowly, and I couldn't help tracing the outline of his face with my eyes. The faint scar above his eyebrow, the one from falling off his bike when he was 10. I remembered kissing that same scar and saying, "It'll fade someday." It never did. Neither did what came after. The silence between us had begun on a warm summer morning. He was 19, too old to listen, too young to understand what love costs a mother. He had come downstairs with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "I'm moving in with Dad," he'd said, not looking at me. The air left my lungs. "We talked about this, Eli. Your father—" "Understands me," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You never do." I had so many things I wanted to say then, that his father had walked away when Eli was 6, that I had built every part of his world with my own 2 hands, that everything I had ever done, every shift, every sacrifice was for him. But pride is a cruel companion. So instead, I said, "Fine, go." He did, and he didn't look back. For the first few weeks, I waited. I cooked too much food, kept his room exactly as he left it, even left the window slightly open, as if he might climb through it like he used to after sneaking out with friends. But as months passed, his calls grew shorter. Then came the last message. "I need space. Please don't contact me for a while." A while became a year. Then another, and another. I learned to pretend. At church, I smiled when people asked about him. "He's doing great." At work, I poured myself into extra shifts. When I came home, I spoke to the empty house as if he could still hear me. "You laugh at this, Eli," I'd say, stirring soup for one. Sometimes at night I'd scroll through his old photos, his graduation, his birthday, the fishing trip we took when he was 12. I'd hover my thumb over his contact and then lock the phone again. Because mothers don't chase. They wait. 7 years later, that wait ended with a single word: Mom. Now, as I sat beside him, I realized I didn't even know who he was anymore. The boy who used to tell me everything had become a man I barely recognized. The door opened and a nurse stepped in. "You can stay a little longer," she said kindly. "He'll need rest, but familiar voices help." I nodded. When she left, I leaned closer to his bed. His hand rested near the edge, bruised but strong. Tentatively, I placed mine over it. For a moment, I expected him to pull away. He didn't. His fingers twitched, just slightly, but it was enough to make tears burn behind my eyes. I whispered, "Do you remember how you used to hold my hand crossing the street? You'd squeeze 3 times, one for I, one for love, one for you." I smiled faintly. I still remember. He didn't wake, but the corners of his mouth softened just a little, like he was hearing me through whatever fog he was lost in. And for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel completely alone. Some houses creak because they're old. Mine creaked because it remembered. When I returned home from the hospital that night, the rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered. The porch light flickered as if unsure whether to welcome me or stay dark. I stood there, key trembling in my hand, before stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books, the same way it always had. Eli's shoes still sat by the door, dusty now but untouched. His room upstairs was frozen in time, the guitar leaning against the wall, the posters, the chipped mug he'd left on his desk. For years I couldn't bring myself to move a thing. It felt like betrayal. Sometimes I'd talk to the walls. "He'll come back," I'd whisper, dusting his shelves. "He just needs time." Time. That word again. It both healed and haunted me. I walked to the kitchen. The broken mug from earlier still lay on the floor, a fresh wound in a house already full of scars. I swept the pieces carefully and placed them in a box marked Eli's things. Then I sat down, hands trembling. I wanted to call him, but I didn't know what to say. I missed you? Too small. I love you? Too late. I forgive you? Too soon. So I did what I'd done for 7 years. I waited. But the silence of the house that night didn't feel as heavy as before. Somewhere deep down, I felt it. A shift. Maybe waiting had finally meant something. Some truths hide in plain sight. Others wait patiently. Under pillows, inside drawers, behind the years we refuse to face. When I visited Eli again 2 days later, he was awake, weak but alert. The bruises had faded slightly, and his eyes followed me when I entered. He said, "You came back." I said I would. We talked about small things, the weather, his doctors, nothing that mattered, and yet everything that did. The awkwardness between us was like a language we were both trying to relearn. He fell asleep halfway through a story about his job. I stayed, tidying the side table. When I adjusted his pillow, something crinkled beneath it. A folded envelope, my name on it. I froze. My hands shook as I pulled it out. The paper was creased, the ink smudged. The first line hit me like a blow. "Mom, if you ever read this, it means I didn't know how to say what I needed to when I still had time." The rest of the letter was raw, messy, heartbreakingly honest. He wrote about the anger he'd carried, the resentment he never understood, how he'd blamed me for things that weren't my fault, his father leaving, his confusion, his loneliness. And then, I thought distance would make me free, but it just made me forget who I was. Every time something good happened, I wanted to call you. Every time something bad happened, I missed you. I'm sorry for taking so long to come home. Tears blurred the page. I read the letter twice, then folded it back carefully and slipped it under the pillow again. Some words are meant to stay close to the heart. When he woke up later, I didn't mention it. I just smiled and asked if he was hungry. He smiled back, small, tired, but real. And in that moment, I realized forgiveness doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it simply needs to be understood. Every journey back home is shorter than the one that took you away, because by the time you decide to return, your heart has already been waiting there. Eli was discharged a week later. I offered to drive him home, my home, and to my surprise, he said yes. The drive was quiet at first. The radio hummed softly, rain began to fall again, as if the sky couldn't decide whether to cleanse or mourn. We passed familiar places, the bakery we used to visit, the park where he learned to ride a bike. His eyes followed them, wordless. Finally, he said, "I didn't think you'd still live here." I smiled faintly. "Where else would I go?" He didn't answer, but I caught the guilt in his expression. When we reached the house, he hesitated on the porch. He said, "It feels smaller." "That's because you grew up," I said. Inside, he looked around, touching the photos, the shelves, the life he'd abandoned. He paused at the staircase and looked up at his old room. "Go on," I whispered. "It's still yours." He went up slowly, like walking through memory. I stayed downstairs listening to his footsteps creak across the floorboards. For the first time in years, the house sounded alive again. Healing doesn't always happen in hospitals. Sometimes it begins in the drive home, in the silence where love relearns how to breathe. A few days later, I found myself back at St. Mary's, signing release papers for one of his checkups. The nurse who'd seen me before smiled. "Your son's lucky to have you," she said. I smiled, but it wavered. Maybe I'm the lucky one. While waiting, I passed by his old room. Empty now, the bed neatly made, machine silent. I stood there for a moment, hand on the doorframe. This was where he'd called me Mom again, where everything began to heal. And suddenly I realized something. I had been angry for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be grateful. That night, I wrote a letter of my own, one he'd find later. "Eli, if you ever forget what forgiveness sounds like, remember that night you said, 'Mom,' that was enough. You can outgrow your clothes, your toys, your fears, but never the sound of your mother's voice calling you home." Eli began spending more time with me again. Sometimes he'd help in the garden, sometimes we'd just sit quietly on the porch. One afternoon, while sorting through the attic boxes, he found his childhood sketchbook. "Do you remember this?" he asked, flipping through messy drawings of dragons and stick figure families. "I remember every page," I said. "You used to make me hang them on the fridge." He smiled, a real one this time, bright and young. Why'd you keep all of it? Because one day, I said softly, I knew you'd come looking for yourself again. He didn't say anything after that, but he kept the sketchbook on the coffee table from that day onward. Later that night, I caught him standing in the hallway staring at the old family photo, me, him, and his father. I don't remember him much anymore, he said quietly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes forgetting is how we survive. He nodded, eyes glassy. You remember enough for both of us, don't you? I smiled faintly. That's a mother's job.
Some apologies don't need to be perfect. They just need to start, even if they end in tears. It was late when he finally spoke. We were sitting by the fire, the clock ticking softly behind us. Mom, he began, voice unsteady. I don't even know where to start. You already did, I said gently. He shook his head. No, I was cruel. I said things I didn't mean. I thought leaving would fix everything, but it just broke us both. I reached for his hand. We both broke, Eli, but that's what makes us human. He looked down, tears slipping silently. I just wish I could go back. I squeezed his fingers. We don't need to go back. We just need to go forward. Together this time. He laughed through tears. You make it sound easy. It's not, but love rarely is. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with the kind of warmth words could never create. Then he whispered, I missed you, Mom. And I said the only thing that truly mattered. I never stopped missing you. Forgiveness doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly, like the moment you realize you're no longer angry, just tired of hurting. It was raining again that night. Maybe life had a way of coming full circle, the same sound, the same storm, but different hearts inside the same walls. Eli and I were sitting at the kitchen table, 2 cups of tea between us. The old clock on the wall ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. He was scrolling through his phone, showing me pictures from his years away. A few smiles, a few shadows. Then he stopped at one photo. A tiny apartment, a small Christmas tree, and him sitting alone beside it. He said, I thought I was free, his voice trembling. But I was just lost. I reached over and turned the phone off. I said, you found your way back. That's what matters. He looked up at me, eyes red. You shouldn't have forgiven me this easily. I smiled faintly. Oh, honey, it wasn't easy. I forgave you 1,000 times before you ever said sorry. Tears welled in his eyes. Why? Because that's what mothers do. We forgive in silence, long before our children are ready to hear it. For a long time, we sat there, the sound of the rain filling the spaces between us. Then slowly, he stood and walked around the table. Before I could speak, he knelt beside my chair and wrapped his arms around me. I froze, then melted into his embrace. His voice was muffled against my shoulder. He said, I don't deserve you, Mom. And I said what I'd been waiting 7 long years to say. You never had to. For the first time in a decade, the house didn't feel empty. It felt forgiven. The hardest part of any storm is believing the sun will rise again. But it always does, quietly, gently, without needing to be asked. The morning after that storm was the softest I'd seen in years. Light spilled through the curtains, painting the kitchen golden. The kettle whistled, the smell of toast filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt simple again. Eli came downstairs, hair messy, still half asleep. Morning, he mumbled. Morning, I said, smiling. Tea's ready. He sat across from me, and for a few minutes, we ate in silence. But it wasn't the old silence anymore. It was the kind that feels safe, the kind that heals. He looked around the kitchen, eyes lingering on the framed photo on the wall. One eye taken when he was 8, grinning with 2 missing teeth. You kept that up all this time? He asked. I never took it down, I said. It reminded me of who you really are.
He smiled, the same crooked grin from that photo. I think I finally remember that kid again. I reached over and touched his hand. Good. Bring him home with you this time. He laughed softly, eyes shining. You know, I never told you, but that night in the hospital, when I called you Mom, I didn't plan to. It just slipped out. I know. That's how truth works. It doesn't ask permission. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world was washed clean, glistening with new beginnings. Eli stood up and looked out the window. He said, "It's funny," he said quietly. "For years, I thought I was running away from this house, but maybe I was just trying to find my way back to it." "And did you?" I asked. He turned, eyes soft. "Yeah," he said. "I think I finally did." He walked over, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "I love you, Mom." And that morning, with sunlight warming the worn wooden table, I realized something beautiful. Some stories don't end when the storm passes. They begin when forgiveness finally feels like home.